Hello, welcome to the LaRouche PAC Weekly Report for December the 7th, 2011. I'm John Hofle, and with me in the studio today are Jason Ross and Sky Shields of our basement team, and Lyndon LaRouche. Good morning, Lynn.
Good morning. What I do in particular relies very much on this area of work, questioning, both in psychology and also in economics. So in the forecasting, in economic forecasting in particular, most people, including economists, are clinically insane. That is, their function as a forecaster is insane. It's based on assumptions which are not true. This is also true in other cases. So, for example, when you're dealing with, say, forecasting, or you're dealing with certain areas of economics, such as the question of time. Like the people believe in clock time. They believe that clock time is that. But most of us believe in sort of instantaneous time. Instantaneous. It's not true. And that's where this comes in. What you find out is that what we call sense perception is merely an instrument. But behind it, there are considerations such as metaphor, which is very crucial, which does not correspond exactly to sense perception. And this is economic forecasting in particular. This is particularly true, for example, Laplace. Laplace's work on sense certainty, on time, is complete fakery, completely unreliable. What most people consider forecasting is completely unreliable. It has no correspondence to truth. But since they rely on the assumption that sense certainty, in this case, is perfect, is your best instrument, it tells you truth, most people are incompetent in this area. It's very important in general to say that sense perception is not truth. Sense perception is a useful instrument which is not intrinsically reliable. And this is the area which I do most of my work in this area, both in the standpoint, some cases in dealing with people who have psychological problems, functional psychological problems, which I've had to deal with at times. This is essentially clear because people go quite mad sometimes as a result of this sort of thing. And that's at the same time, this has other implications. So what we say, we call this, in the first case, metaphor. For science, the understanding of metaphor is essential, particularly for forecasting, because sense perception says that what you're seeing, forecasting, is directly is the truth. A scientist says, no, it's not the truth. What you think is an instant process, is actually a process of delay over some period of time. So that's the area we're getting into. This is the idea of space and time, as most people take them for granted. Well, fine, it's perfectly useful and proper to use that kind of information when you're driving a car or something like that. But when it comes to scientific questions, it's not reliable. Then we get to we get to these other things, I think, as we go along. But the point is, the key thing to take into account, which is not in sense perception, the most important thing that's not sense perception, is creativity. In other words, forecasting the future, if you try to do it by simple mechanical forecasting, it's incompetent. And this is the area where I've had my charm, where I've had my greatest success in the area of forecasting. I've never run up against anyone who was competent at actual economic forecasting. I find out people who will look at the subject with a certain kind of insight, which is useful, but they don't understand the principle of forecasting. And that's because they rely on sense perception. The other factor here, which is related to this, is human creativity. Now, there is such a thing as human creativity, which is not just novelty. There actually is an ability to understand that what you thought you saw was not what you saw. It was a shadow of what you saw, and that sort of thing. So this is extremely important now because we're in a general breakdown of the world economy. I'm good at this forecasting. Most people around the world are incompetent and that's one of the crises. So this is kind of important now, since if you believe in the ordinary forecasting, you are intrinsically incompetent. That doesn't mean you're useless. It means you've got a brain. You use it fairly well, not ordinarily, but when you come to actual forecasting, you don't know what you're doing. And we're now in a period where forecasting of that type is crucial. For example, we are headed to hell. Why do I know we're headed to hell? That doesn't mean we're going to go there, but we're going in that direction now, and it's coming up fast. Right now, if you continue the present policies which prevail in Europe and in the United States, this nation, those nations, are finished. They're going into the greatest crisis you can imagine. A nightmare, probably even the extinction of the human species. And these poor fellows have no idea of what they're up against. You have people who have an intelligent reaction to trends that they experience. They react on that. But to actually forecast, to foresee where we're going, where the present trends in thinking in society, very few people. And so that's what the importance of this subject is. We had a presentation of this, which I gave last night, and I thought we'd go through it again today with these people who are no longer ingenues in this matter, and get their view of what I said last night.
Well, I mean, it is essential to get a real understanding of what metaphor is. I think that sometimes concepts that seem almost basic we can ignore because we think we already understand them. So if you take the case of metaphor, it's got a foolish definition that most people understand. But why it's essential right now is that there is no ability to even conceptualize the future world that we have to have if you are unable to get beyond the world as presented to us by our senses. And that makes sense in the sciences, just in terms of needing breakthroughs in science, and it exists in economics, where the economic system that we're operating under right now treats money as a true reality. So we've got bailouts regarding money and things like this. The simple fact is that money or any other value of that sort is inadequate for understanding how an economy functions because it's unable to change in a qualitative way. So relationships among money are unable to express the kinds of changes that really transform the meaning of it as it's used. In that way, using a monetarist system is the same way as starting with a deductive geometry. You have a certain number of possible actions, and they're really already defined in advance. That's why when you see these bailouts that are being proposed in Europe, they're never exactly a surprise. It's always just more money. What we need to do instead is base a real economic recovery, a total economic transformation on the real nature of the human soul, of the human individual. And unlike the animals, we're able to go beyond treating our senses, as you said with the surgeries, for an example. We're able to go beyond treating our senses as part of us or as reflecting the world around us. So whenever we have a contradiction, say it's between two actual senses, between sight and hearing, we're able to go beyond the use of our senses to use our intellect to understand what's actually going on that presents itself in different ways to our different senses. Beyond the senses themselves, that comes up in just the way you think about any subject. Sometimes you might say to yourself, well, what do I think about something or another? And in your mind, you've got different ways of approaching it. You might say, well, I might look at it from this standpoint. Well, I might look at it from this standpoint. They often contradict each other, which I'm sure people have noticed when you think about subjects like this. Our ability to go beyond that contradiction, to realize that there's just something that we're missing in the thought, which is what Plato-Socrates does all the time in his dialogues, that's the kind of approach that we need to understand on a larger scale right now, very immediately, where there's really no hope of not being stuck in sort of a strategic game board politically and a dying economic system.
Well, the first thing is the question of what this metaphor principle. We rely instinctively, so to speak, We rely upon our senses to give us the guide of what reality is. We believe that our sense perceptions are reality. Now, but what happens with this thing? Sense perception is never true in the first place. It is merely a useful tool, the question of time. What we rely upon are these sense perceptions, which, as I said, are not viable. We actually have to go into the area of physics, real physics, and to look at the different kinds of, look at sense perception as a function, look at the organs of sense perception, and realize that these are not competent. These are useful but not competent. They're shadows. You're getting a shadow of something, which is not the reality. If you want to find reality, you will have to go into physical science. You cannot rely directly on the sense perceptions as such, because you have these senses, which are really highly imperfect. But if you want to understand how the universe operates, you have to go beyond simple sense perception and use other senses. For example, we use in physical science, we examine all kinds of things in physical science. We no longer believe in what we sense. We find ways of measuring in different senses of measurement to measure physical processes in the very small, for example. So therefore we abandon reliance upon ordinary sense perception and we go to physical science in the physical domain. We now, instead of using our senses, which are highly imperfect, we rely upon physical principles in the very small. And this is the, Riemann, of course, is responsible for much of this, much of this discovery. So we go away from sense perception and we go into physics. We measure things in the very small, different kinds of things which are in the physical domain. And we compare what we think of is sense perception in terms of cause and effect. And we find that what we rely upon in sense perception does not give us the ability to forecast or to understand. So therefore we go to microphysics and things of that sort. We go into the very small and the very large, which is like Riemann defines this process. You consider the very, very large, the galactic, and the very, very small, both of which are completely out of the range of ordinary sense perception. Now we take this scientific view, and instead of reading events and forecasting in terms of sense perception, we now look at things in terms of the microphysics and great macrophysics, which is this third section, the concluding section of Riemann's habilitation dissertation, where this is laid out as the crucial, why he says, in order to find truth, we've got to leave the domain of sense perception. We've got to leave the domain of ordinary mathematics and go into another domain. And that's where I work in, that thing. And it's going away from sense perception as such, which is the ordinary kind of thing, the very small, the rather small, but not the very small, and the very large, which does not exist for the ordinary person, but only exists through the aid of physical science in the very large. But this is what we mean by physics. So you leave the department of mathematics, which is a useful area, but it's not a truthful area. Right. And you go into the domain of the very large and the very small, which you no longer rely upon sense perception as such, and now like on electronics, for example. Electronics is a much better indication of what knowledge is than that. And it's that difference. The very idea of space and time, for example, again, is a Riemannian conception. The question of what is the difference between physical time, which is what we measure in the very small and the very large, as opposed to clock time. Clock time is not reliable. And the basic thing that, above all, what sense perception is absolutely useless for, is creativity. Sense perception will never define creativity. And that was the great revolution which occurred in the 19th century through the work of people like Riemann and those who followed him in the end of the century. People like Planck and Mach and Einstein. This creativity process has one name, metaphor, if you understand it. metaphor is the highest quality of the human mind.
Right.
And if people do not have a reliable concept of metaphor, they lack actual creativity. They can, they're gamblers. They can gamble on riches will become to them. Gamble
But you can't guarantee it.
They do not experience in their own mind the experience of change, of this qualitative change, which gives you an indication of creating the future. Now, ordinary animals do not have a human mentality. They do not have real creativity. They have innovation, but not creativity. They have learning capabilities, but they live a century in the past. Only the human mind and its creative phase actually gets into this area. But then what that means is that the development of the galaxy and beyond the galaxy was a process which was already in a creative process of development. The principle of creativity is inherent in the universe. And mankind's emergence as mankind, as a creative power, is a product of the principle of creativity in the universe itself. Because the universe is always changing. It's changing qualitatively. The changes are always qualitative. So the universe is creative inherently. And mankind is a particular expression of the universal principle of creativity, which is manifest in the development of living processes on Earth. So therefore, if we want to live and survive as a species, we have to fire Obama immediately. I mean it, exactly. But the British Empire actually controls him. But this is the threat to the extinction of mankind. The human race demands that he be removed from office now. He's clinically insane. Take him out of office. The point is, function of the principle of creativity as such remains.
Right.
And it's the only thing that, as experience shows, that can save mankind from self-destruction. The universe will continue. Man, under Obama and the British monarchy, would not. And we're on the edge of that right now. Where are the people who have the guts and brains to recognize that and to throw this guy out of office? Obviously, all those figures in the Congress and in the presidency who do not throw him out of office now as a necessary action for the defense of humanity, who have other priorities than that, are implicitly criminals. Not throwing him out of office is a crime against humanity. He's insane, criminally insane. What's wrong with the people who don't throw him out of office when they have the power to do so?
Right. That inaction is an action.
Exactly. So sometimes you leave the area of mathematics, as Riemann said in the conclusion of his habilitation dissertation. Leave the department of mathematics because it's useless for science, in a sense. Therefore, we have to rely upon those other faculties we have, of which we pretend we don't know, or condition ourselves into not knowing. The question of creativity. And to me, that's the most enjoyable thing about life. To me, creativity of that sort is the experience of life.